Are there really only 5 senses? That's the question I'm going to ask today. Imagine the senses that would have been involved in this story, which comes from A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His colour changed, though, when without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leapt up, as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Then he looked the phantom through and through, but was still incredulous and fought against his senses. Well, do we have the sorts of senses that would let us see ghosts or flying saucers, or do we only have our standard 5 senses? That's the question I want to ask today. Well, first let me say that the immediate conclusion is that we have far more senses than we know about. We only know about those senses that we use to explore the outside world. But what about the interior world of our bodies? There's a great deal going on in there, and its control requires sensory systems just as much as the control of our behavior in going out and exploring the world. Our body is full of sense organs that we are only dimly aware of if we're aware of them at all. I'm going to demonstrate some of the actions of those sense organs to you. And I've got Toby here in the audience, who's very kindly volunteered to help. I wonder if you'd come up now, Toby. Toby's kindly let us put some equipment onto him that was supplied by Dr. Heinz Wolf at the Clinical Research Center. And this is a very clever piece of apparatus which has electrodes strapped around the chest, and it picks up signals from the heart and from the movements of breathing. Those signals are monitored and transmitted from this infrared transmitter to a detector up here, then picked up by an amplifier and played on this pen recorder. Well now, Toby, I wonder if you could just come forward, stand in front of the audience, and just relax. Just try and relax. No, Toby, relax. Now, the pen recorders at the moment are listening to Toby's heart and to his respiration. You can hear bleeps. I hope you're going to hear bleeps, which will indicate when his heart... Oh, I think perhaps it's because the recorder isn't hearing you. There you are, you see, the infrared radiation wouldn't pass through his body. Now it's hearing very clearly. You can hear the beeps corresponding to the beat of the heart, and at the moment his heart rate, he seems to be a little bit nervous perhaps. It's about 120 beats a minute, which is a bit fast. Forget about the television, Toby. The red pen, which you can see here, is plotting his heart rate. The more it goes over to the left, the higher the heart rate. And the black pen, which is bobbing up and down, is plotting his breathing movements. Could you breathe in deeply, please, Toby? And now out. You see how the pen bobs backwards and forwards. Okay, let's ask the question, what controls his heart? What controls his breathing? It's not his ears or his eyes. You see his heart rate slowing down. You're beginning to relax a bit now, Toby. Okay. Could you help us then by doing a bit of exercise? If you jump on there, okay, and you just ride away while we listen to your heart. Now, what Toby's doing is exercising, increasing his metabolism, changing the composition of his blood. He's moving his limbs. All of those things involve the activation of sense organs that he doesn't know about. He's not conscious of them. They're inside him. Already, I think you can hear his heart rate starting to increase. The receptors that are involved in telling his heart to increase, to tell his breathing to increase, those receptors are scattered inside the body. There are receptors in the joints of the legs, for instance, which detect the movements that he's making now and tell his brain the body's active, make the heart beat faster. Then there are chemical detectors inside the blood vessels, which pick up the level, detect the level of gases dissolved in the blood. When he's exercising, the carbon dioxide level's building up in his blood, and perhaps if he exercised enough, the oxygen level might even start to fall. It's those very tiny changes in chemical composition of the blood, picked up by sense organs in the blood vessels, which control his respiration through reflexes involving the brain. Now you can see, I think, carry on, Debbie. You can see the way that the red pen has moved a long way over to the left. The heart rate is now 170 beats. I think you better stop, actually. 170 beats a minute. That's been produced by the very rapid exercise that he's been doing. Thanks very much indeed, Toby. You can go and put your clothes on. So we really do have sense organs that we're not normally aware of. Extra senses, if you like, that don't enter our conscious mind. All of our senses, though, depend, as far as we know, on just 4 types of specialized tiny cells. Cells that are sensitive to things that are happening in the outside or the inside world. These 4 sorts of cells detect either light in the eye, chemicals, taste and smell, and the oxygen and carbon dioxide detectors, temperature in the skin and in the brain, there are temperature detectors, and finally, the universal, ever so useful mechanical detector, like those hair cells that I told you about in the ear, like the touch fibers in the skin, and many other examples that I'll mention during these lectures. Cells that are just sensitive to mechanical deformation, but which are used for detecting all sorts of outside and inside events. But nevertheless, we ought to ask, although we should be very proud of our senses, could other animals do better than we do? Could they have senses which are better or even different from ours? That's the question that I'm going to ask in this lecture. Let's look, first of all, at the performance of our eye. How much can we see with our eye? Is it possible that other animals could see more? Now, I have here a diagram which shows the full range of electromagnetic radiation. Remember that light is just one species of electromagnetic radiation. All forms of electromagnetic radiation involve a beam of energy with vibrations that can be considered as having 2 components, an electrical component which vibrates at 90 degrees to the direction of the path of the ray, and a mechanical component which vibrates in the other direction at 90 degrees to that. So all the vibrations lie at 90 degrees to the direction of the path of propagation of the wave. But if we look at the diagram, we'll see that the full range of electromagnetic radiation stretches from very, very high energy, short wavelength gamma rays, right through to the sorts of very long wavelength electromagnetic radiation that one finds associated with electronic circuits. Now, our vision is restricted to this little tiny window in the middle, which is expanded down below to show the spectrum of colors of Isaac Newton. Our view of the electromagnetic radiation around us is restricted to that tiny chink in the window. Well, could it be that other animals could extend their range of vision beyond that window? Well, you know, our vision is, as one might expect from the miracle of evolution, very well adapted to our needs. You see, the light from the sun that reaches the surface of the Earth includes wavelengths from about 300 nanometers in the ultraviolet part of the spectrum through to about 1100 nanometers in the infrared. Our eye, that is, selects the middle of that range. That is the peak emission of energy from our own sun reaching the Earth. Our eye is clearly adapted to respond to our sun. But there is energy at the extreme ends, at the ultraviolet and at the infrared, which might be used. Let's first of all look at animals that survey a slightly different part of our range because their environment is a little bit different from ours. Water, unlike air, doesn't allow red light to go through it very well. So the deeper you go in the oceans, the less and less red light there is around. And what one finds is that if you study the eyes of fishes that live at deeper and deeper and deeper levels in the ocean, the pigments in their eye are less and less sensitive to red light. And in the depths of the ocean, where there is only blue light and a little ultraviolet light, the pigments in the eye are sensitive only to that blue part of the spectrum. The piece of film, which you can see now, shows typical deep-sea fish. They're really very ugly creatures, perhaps because they know very well that there's so little light, their friends around them won't see them. And in fact, they're so ugly that people won't buy them to eat. These sorts of fish, when they're caught, are used for fish fingers, I'm afraid. They're a very drab color. A lot of deep-sea fish have developed the trick of creating their own light. They have special cells called chromophores on them, which use a chemical reaction to generate a dim light. They have these usually on their belly, so that as they swim along, when they're seen from below, the light that they make matches the light at the surface of the water, and therefore makes them invisible. One particular fish, shown in this next picture, has a remarkable adaptation, again using self-generated light. This is an anglerfish, a deep-sea fish, and it has this strange thing on the end of its nose, which uses a chemical reaction to make light, and other smaller fish are attracted to that light from around the anglerfish, and I think you can guess what the anglerfish does to them. It uses its own light to attract its prey. Well, what about beyond our own visible spectrum? Let's look first at the ultraviolet. What use would it be to an animal to have ultraviolet vision? There certainly is ultraviolet light around us. It's filtered out to a large extent by the optics of our eye, which are very slightly yellow, and therefore select out and reject any ultraviolet light. But many animals, particularly insects, have high sensitivity for ultraviolet light. Well, what could they see that we can't see? What they could see would be any pattern that reflects or absorbs specifically ultraviolet light. Well, in fact, many insects, for instance butterflies, have markings on them which are only visible in ultraviolet illumination when you have an eye that's sensitive to ultraviolet light. And plants have even taken advantage of the ultraviolet sensitivity of insects and have become modified to interact in their life with insects. The next piece of film shows a very nice example of that. We're going to see, first of all, a human's view of a bee's world. A bee climbing over flowers, searching for nectar, carrying pollen. But the bee sees the flowers quite differently because it has ultraviolet sensitivity. There are the flowers as we would see them, and now the same flower as a bee would see it. These dark lines leading towards the middle of the flower are called honey guides, and they're visible to an ultraviolet sensitive eye because they consist of material that absorbs ultraviolet light and therefore appears very black when it's illuminated with ultraviolet light. So the flower has developed these honey guides to tell the bees where to go in order to collect the honey and in order to collect the pollen. Well, let's turn now to the other end of the visible spectrum, the infrared. There is infrared light from the sun around the Earth. We choose not to handle it with our eye, and indeed it can't pass through the optics of our eye. Very sensible that we shouldn't, because you'll remember from my previous discussions, it's impossible to form an image of all wavelengths of light, because, as you saw from my demonstration with Newton's prism, an optical system bends some colors of light more than others. If our eye tried to handle everything from blue through to infrared, the image couldn't contain all of those rays focused together. Indeed, no biological optical instrument can form images using transparent biological optics of infrared light because it gets absorbed. Well, there are ways of forming images of infrared light, and one particular example shown here, it's not an animal but a machine made by man. It's an infrared camera made by Barr and Stroud in Scotland. It's a very sophisticated instrument. I'm afraid it doesn't take much imagination to know in what context this sort of machine was developed. It only came off the classified list just over a year ago. It's used, I'm afraid, for military purposes. because you see, it can see in the dark, and we'll see that in a moment. Can we have a look at the picture from the infrared camera, please, Bill? What we're going to do is turn the lights down completely and switch to the view that the infrared camera is getting of you in the audience. The lights are going right down. Now we've gone to the infrared camera, and if you look up at the monitors, now you see wherever the skin is hot, the image is bright and white. It's heat from the body which is stimulating the infrared camera. Perhaps we could even look at a piece of electronics, Bill. There's a TV camera. There we are. Yes, that's fine. The lens is black, but the warm body of the camera is glowing. Back to the faces. You see how cold the noses are. Look at his nose. Oh, that's quite a warm nose, actually. And they're a bit darker. So different parts of the body emit more heat. Thank you very much, Bill. Now, this is a very expensive instrument. It costs about £55,000. One of the main reasons is that this lens here, which costs us £7,000 or £8,000, has to be made of germanium, which transmits infrared light and can form an image with it. Well, why would it be useful for an animal to handle infrared light? Well, if an animal, like that camera, was interested in warm bodies glowing, maybe it would need to develop infrared sensitivity. Animals that like warm bodies are animals that hunt other animals. There are a class of snakes that have infrared sensitivity in special organs, and I want to show them to you. This is a deadly Mexican snake. It's a copperhead snake, and I hope we're going to be able to look very closely at its head. You see a very nice view there in the picture on the monitors at the moment. Below its eyes, the nostrils can't even be seen. Those are tiny openings at the front of the head, but those brown spots underneath the eyes, in front of the eyes, are special infrared eyes. They're called pit organs, and you find them in all the pit vipers of this family, including the rattlesnake. It's a special eye with infrared heat detectors inside, but it can't have a lens in it because the lens would absorb the infrared radiation. What it does instead is to use the principle of a pinhole camera. It has a small hole at the entrance of a pit, and it forms shadowy images inside, but good enough images to be able to tell the direction of a source of heat. Even in the dark, a snake like this can detect a small animal and can snap at it. Inside that pit, which is just a quarter of an inch or less in depth, there are 1 million heat detectors per cubic centimetre of the surface. Each pit, tiny pit in the face's head, has more heat detectors by a factor of 5 times more heat detectors than the entire human body. Well, I'm going to try and give you a glimpse of the world of a snake. Inside the tank here, we have another pit viper, a Mexican moccasin snake with those same pit organs. And we're going to film it with the infrared camera to get a view of the snake and its world as the snake would see it. Thank you. Thanks very much. Yes, we can see it now. There's the snake. I think you can see it. Very, very good, Bill. Thank you. All right, now what I'm going to do is to drop in with the snake on a string, a long string, let me say, a balloon which is filled with warm water. This then would look like the body of a small warm-blooded animal to the snake, so we can see what the world of a snake would look like. Here comes the ball, and you see how brightly it glows in the infrared light. I'm moving it around above the snake now. That then is the sort of view that the snake would have of a warm object. It's moving its head. Do you see the snake moving its head to the side? Although it's probably not very hungry, it's been fed fairly recently. Nevertheless, it's moving its head to follow the warm object. There you see? It's clearly detecting the presence of the object even though it's not touching it. Thank you, Bill. Okay. So there, an extension of sensitivity outside the electromagnetic range of man for a useful biological purpose. there's one more aspect of vision to which we are insensitive, but other animals certainly are sensitive. These rays of light, electromagnetic radiation emitted by the sun, involve vibrations in all possible directions. For every single quantum of light, the vibration is only in one direction, depending on the orientation of the molecule of gas in the sun which emits the quantum of light. But since all the molecules in the sun are disorganized, any ray of light heading towards the Earth is vibrating with different quanta vibrating in all possible directions at 90 degrees to the path of the ray. But imagine if a ray of light comes through the atmosphere of the Earth and strikes a particle and is reflected down to the Earth. The only direction of vibration left for the ray to have, since it must always vibrate at 90 degrees to its direction of propagation, is at 90 degrees like that. So any light passing down to the Earth from scattering objects in the atmosphere is polarized. It has one direction of vibration. Now, we're not able to detect with our eyes the pattern of polarization of light. But let me demonstrate to you what polarization means. This is a candlestick. In fact, it's rather historic. It's a candlestick that belonged to Michael Faraday. And I've got here two pieces of filtering material called polarizing filters, which allow light to go through only if it's vibrating in one direction. So it cuts out a good deal of the light and only lets light go through it if it's vibrating in one particular direction. If I put the piece of filter in front of the candle, you can still see the candle, although it's a little bit darker because some of the light has been cut out. Now, all the light from the candle is vibrating one way. If I take another piece of Polaroid of the same orientation and put it in front, the candle is still visible. Both of these Polaroid filters are lined up together so the light can still get through. But if I turn one of them, gradually, I can snuff out the candle optically and turn it back again, and the candle reappears. Well, the particles in the atmosphere then act rather like polarizing filters, and they cast down a particular pattern of polarization whose arrangement depends on the position of the sun. Well, for any animal that wanted to know the position of the sun, for instance, for navigation, it would be very useful if it could see the pattern of polarization in the sky. Our eye cannot, but certain eyes can, in particular, the eyes of insects. The next slide. This shows a typical insect eye, in this case the eye of a dragonfly. These huge things on the sides of the head are the compound eyes of the insect. They have hundreds, thousands of tiny facets on their surface. Each facet is a little lens system with sensitive cells, light-sensitive cells inside. The big disadvantage of the compound eye is that it doesn't have very good resolution. Its acuity isn't very good. If we had compound eyes, we'd have to look like this. The next picture. To get the same visual acuity that we have, we'd have to have compound eyes more than 1 meter in diameter. But the big advantage of the compound eye is that because the pigment molecules in the eye are all lined up together, as opposed to the disoriented pigments in our rods and cones, the compound eye can be sensitive to the polarization of light. Let's see then what an insect could see in the sky that we don't see. The next picture shows a view of the entire sky in North Africa, in the Sahara Desert, taken through a fisheye lens. The camera was simply pointing up at the sky, and we can see the whole sky with the horizon all around. It's before sunrise, and you can see, I think, that the sun is going to rise about here. If the sun were a little lower, we wouldn't know where the sun was at all. If we had the ability to detect polarization, however, in the sky, we would see a pattern which is quite characteristic of the position of the sun. The next picture shows the same scene photographed through a polarizing filter. And you can see that the stripe of polarized light lying at 90 degrees to the meridian of the sun. Any animal that could see that pattern could know where the sun was even when it wasn't visible. For instance, when it was hidden below the horizon or behind a cloud. Well, animals can use the position of the sun determined this way to guide them in their navigation. I'll be talking more about that in my next lecture. Well, now let's turn from vision to hearing. You saw yesterday that your hearing was restricted to a certain band of frequencies running from about 15 cycles per second up to, well, if you're lucky enough to be under 20, perhaps 18 or 20,000 cycles per second. What about beyond that range? Are there sound vibrations which are lower in frequency than that, or higher in frequency than our range? And are there animals that can detect them and use them? Well, of course, there are. First of all, on the low frequency side, below 15 cycles of vibration per second. There's plenty of energy in the world at those frequencies, and it comes from very odd events in the world. Let me remind you about the basic property of resonance in objects. Large objects tend to produce and to vibrate with very low frequency sounds, and small objects, high frequency sounds. Now, I asked Bill Coates about this, and he said, now I remember that there was something that Sir Lawrence Bragg did about that. I'll hunt in the cellar. And he produced these historic beer bottles for me. These beer bottles, I assure you, were used by Sir Lawrence in his Christmas lectures at the Royal Institution. Now, he found on the bottles some marks and some numbers, so we filled them up with water to the levels shown. And maybe, if we blow air across them to produce resonance in the bottles, we'll hear something. Well, that's a nice Christmas message from Sir Lawrence Bragg. Well then, if resonance and the note produced depends on the object, any enormous object might produce sound of a very low frequency, lower than we can hear. Things like that do happen. Thunderstorms, for instance, rockets being launched, earthquakes, wind blowing over distant mountains can produce vibrations of an incredibly low frequency, and some animals can hear them. The next picture shows the auditory sensitivity of the ordinary homing pigeon. It's a graph which plots the intensity of sound needed for the animal to hear the sound against the frequency of that sound, running from 1/10 of a cycle per second up to, well, in this case, 10 kilocycles, 1,000 cycles a second. The poor human ear is the curve shown by the triangles. We can only hear down to about 10 cycles per second. But the pigeon hears right down here. Indeed, it can probably hear 1/100th of a cycle per second of vibration of sound. The little hatched lines here in the middle show the sort of energy present in thunderstorms and in the sounds of wind over distant mountains. Pigeons can hear them up to thousands of kilometers away. The little square shows the intensity of infrasound produced by Concorde crossing the Atlantic, picked up by an American geophysical station. The geophysical station could hear it, so could a pigeon. Maybe, again, the pigeon uses that information to guide its migration. Well, now let's move to the other end of the spectrum, to ultrasound, beyond 20,000 cycles. We saw yesterday that Fresca the dog could certainly hear higher frequencies than we could. Do animals make use of those sounds? Well, quite clearly they do. Remember that the smaller a resonator, the higher the pitch of sound that it produces. So we would expect ultrasound to be associated with relatively small animals. Well, many, many insects, for instance, produce ultrasound when they move one part of their body against another. I'll talk about that in a moment. But even small mammals, rodents in particular, can produce ultrasound. When a male rat smells a female rat, he wolf whistles at her in ultrasound. We can't hear it, but presumably she can. Now, could I have the next demonstration, please, Bill? Here we've got some mice. In fact, we have a mother mouse and some baby mice, which are just 8 days old today. Because of their small size, baby mice emit almost pure ultrasound. They hardly produce any audible sound at all. Could I borrow one of your babies for a second, please? Thank you very much. Oh, there we are. There's a baby mouse. I'm going to put him down on the bench for a second and turn on this machine. This is a bat detector. It's an instrument that can pick up ultrasound and convert it into sound that we can hear. Let's see if he's making any noise at the moment because of his separation from Mum. Would you like to go in front of this? Can we hear anything? You hear the sound? That's the mouse screaming in ultrasound. The intensity of screaming is about 120 decibels. That is about the same intensity of sound as you would hear if you were standing under Concorde as it approached to land. It wouldn't be surprising then if Mum got rather excited. So small animals use ultrasound to communicate with each other. Thank you very much, Bill. Of course, the best known example of the use of ultrasound is by bats and by dolphins and porpoises. They use very high frequency sound for sonar, for navigation as well as for communication. I've got some nice models that were loaned to me by Professor Pye of Queen Mary College to show the principle of how a bat works, how it can fly in the dark and negotiate around obstacles and recognize tiny targets while it's flying. This, as I've just shown you, is a bat detector, an object which can convert very high-frequency sounds into audible sounds. And this is an artificial bat. It's an ultrasound generator which produces ultrasound of 40 kilohertz. We can't hear it. Remember, the dog could yesterday, but the bat detector will. Now, if I turn the bat detector to about the correct frequency and turn this on, that's the bat. If I turn it off, you can't hear it at all. Now let me show you the property of ultrasound. If I go a long distance away and point it at the receiver, you can hear very clearly. But it's relatively directional. The main energy you can hear now. Ultrasound, because of its short wavelength, is extremely directional like light. And therefore, when the bat sends out bursts of ultrasound and as it cries, that sound impinges on objects only directly ahead. The bat can use reflections to analyze the content of the world around it. Let's try and build an artificial bat by placing the bat next to the bat detector. Here's the bat crying, here are the bat's ears, and let's switch to a continuous 40 kilohertz signal, turn on the bat detector. By tuning precisely, we can eliminate most of the scattered sound. If I place my hand in the beam, you can hear the reflections from my own hand. I'm reflecting the sound back to the bat's ears. Now imagine a moth comes along in the bat's field of view. Here's our artificial moth. You're hearing what a bat might hear. Thank you very much, Bill. The reason for the variation in frequency which you could hear was the Doppler shift produced by the movement of the fan blades. Movement, changing the reflection point backwards and forwards, alters the frequency of the sound returning to the animal's ears. So the bat has many clues from the echoes that it hears around us about the content of the world. And as we well know, that allows bats to do extraordinary things in avoidance and in catching insects. The piece of film that I have to show next shows a bat catching mealworms thrown into the air in total darkness. It's a very much slowed down film. Those are mealworms being thrown up, and there's the bat catching them, sometimes in its wing, guiding itself entirely by sonar. The next slide shows the commonest British bat, the tiny pipistrelle bat. Against the slide, you can see the size of a match head. It's a very tiny animal, but has a very sophisticated song. Could we hear the song of the pipistrelle, please? This is very much slowed down. You're hearing it played at 1/32nd of the normal speed, so that it's moved into our auditory range. And the pipistrelle is just approaching an insect in the air. You hear the pulses speeding up as it gets closer and closer to the target. Now it catches it. Thank you. Well, not surprisingly, in the battle of evolution, although bats have produced these clever tricks, the insects have struck back. Many insects have developed methods for detecting bats, for knowing where they are and for responding to them. The next picture, in fact, shows an animal that has perfected this by having an ear in a vein in its wing. This is a lacewing, a tiny insect, very common in this country in summer. It has a vibrating sense organ with only 30 sensory cells in it, suspended in a vein in the forewing. This acts as an ear which is tuned to the frequencies emitted by bats. And when the insect hears this, it goes into a kind of tumbling dive. Now, this is a difficult demonstration. It may not work, but I'm going to try and demonstrate to you the tumbling reaction of lacewings. I've got here a pot of lacewings. I'm going to throw them into the air, and I hope that I'm going to be able to shoot them down with the bat, just by firing ultrasound at them. Let's turn on the bat detector so that we can hear it. Yes, thank you. Now we'll go to a pulsed signal, which is more like a real bat. That's the kind of signal that a bat gives off. I'm going to throw these in the air and see if I can shoot them down. So watch very carefully against the black background. It's a very, well, not too... Maybe it's not hearing me. Well, we fortunately made a piece of videotape this morning which shows much more clearly the reaction. Can we have the videotape, please? There in slow motion, watch the lacewing. It should tumble as I switch on there. That's the tumbling reaction of the lacewing when it hears the ultrasound. One problem is, and I think it may do it once more, one problem is that ultrasound is very directional, so it's actually quite difficult for me to point the artificial bat directly at the lacewing. If we look then at the next piece of film, it shows another animal that's developed the same trick of detecting the bat, avoiding it very cleverly. This shows moths flying, and if we watch the moths, we'll see them suddenly begin to fall, to tumble as a bat comes across. If we watch next time, you'll see a moth rising here. Now watch it carefully, very much slowed down. It's just going to begin to tumble. Now it's falling downwards, out of view, just as a bat comes sweeping across. And finally, the ultimate stage in the battle between insects and bats, some insects have developed the trick of sending out a pulse of ultrasound to jam the bat's own radar system. The next picture shows an insect that's developed this trick particularly well. This is a peacock butterfly. The picture was taken with a flash camera, and the flash was triggered at the moment that a microphone picked up the ultrasonic click produced by the butterfly. The butterfly is being made to click by tickling it with a paintbrush. You can see the position it's in. Its wings are wide open. In fact, this butterfly produces its click by snapping open its wings to an extra wide position. It does that when it picks up ultrasound through its little ear system, and that click interferes with the bat's detection. And the bat has its signals jammed by the butterfly. Well, many other animals produce sounds that are partly audible, partly ultrasound. The best examples of insects that make noises are, of course, the grasshoppers, the crickets, and the cicadas. Can I have the next piece of film, please, which shows a domestic grasshopper, British grasshopper, and you can hear the sound produced by the stridulation, the movement, in this case, of the legs over the wing cases, rubbing one part of the body against another, rubbing a serrated surface against another to produce those sounds. We can hear some of the sounds, but other grasshoppers can hear much more. Grasshoppers and crickets communicate to each other through these sounds. They can tell each other their sex, their physiological state, they can define their territory, they can say which subspecies they are, and so on, purely communicating through the sounds that they produce by rubbing parts of their bodies together. Well, again, evolution's a constant interplay of sense organs and apparatus for detecting sounds and communication. The next visitor is an animal that's learnt about the ultrasound emitted by grasshoppers and crickets. It's a bird-eating, so-called bird-eating spider, although most of its food is not birds, but insects like crickets. It's in the tarantula family, quite a dangerous spider. And it has ears in its arms. When it hears the ultrasound produced by a grasshopper or a cricket, it lifts its arms up to listen. There are little resonant chambers inside the second pair of legs which contain the ears. Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. Well, we've seen then how other animals are able to exploit different parts of the energy range below our hearing and above our hearing. There are special problems for animals that live in water. The conduction of sound in water is quite different from that in air. First of all, it travels much more quickly, about 4 or 5 times more quickly. And secondly, sounds in water don't pass out into the air, and equally sounds in the air don't go into the water very efficiently because of this problem of the matching of resistance that I talked about when I was discussing the human ear. A fish in the water can't hear much that's happening outside, but it can hear the vibrations and the sounds produced by other objects in the water. Now, could I have a volunteer who could help me with, could you just come down for a second to help me to show this? I'm going to turn on a recording which is being played from a tape recorder through a loudspeaker in water. And I think you'll find that the microphone is quite incapable of picking it up. But when I tell you to, could you put the microphone into the water? At the moment we're hearing nothing at all, the sound's being dispersed in the water. But, well, very little. Okay, could you put the microphone in? Now we hear very much more clearly. What we're listening to is the song of a whale. The song of a humpback whale. You can see a picture of the humpback whale in the next slide. The sound spectrum of this song is very broad, containing infrasounds and ultrasounds transmitted through water. Humpback whales sing only in a limited period of the year as they make their way towards the breeding grounds. In principle, the sound could conduct entirely around the Earth. Sounds of these low frequencies, and all the humpback whales of one family sing the same song. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. The whales congregate at the breeding grounds and they modify their song for the coming year. Every year there's a slightly different song which is picked up by the entire group that communicate with each other over enormous distances by crying into the water. There is a particular difficulty in animals detecting sounds in water, and that is the problem of building a resonant device that can communicate the sound vibrations, the pressure changes in the water, to an ear. And most fish have become specially adapted to do this by using an air-filled chamber in their body. The next slide, please, shows a picture of a fish, a squirrel fish, and in the squirrel fish is a thing called a swim bladder. It's an air-filled bladder which connects here to the ear. The swim bladder is used for a number of things. It's used to adjust the buoyancy of the fish, but it's also used to vibrate in sympathy with sounds coming through the water to the fish and communicate those vibrations to the ear. But all fish, many amphibians living in the water, have also developed another kind of sense organ quite different to anything that we know about. It's a system called the lateral line of the fish, and it's sensitive to the actual particle movements in the water associated with vibration. Ears are sensitive to pressure changes. The lateral line is sensitive to movement of particles in the water, the near-field vibrations associated with reflections from objects or movement of other fish. Can I have the next slide, please? This shows the structure of the lateral line organ in a cod. The lateral line consists of a tube, a series of canals just under the skin of the fish, and they communicate with the outside world through little holes, little pores, so that water movement outside the animal causes water movement into these canals. We can see in this high-power view of the head scattered along the canals are sense organs that can detect the vibration of the water, the lateral line system. Now, I'd like to show you an animal that relies on its lateral line down here in this tank, relies on the lateral line much more than most fish do. These are blind cave fish. They live in water in caves. They have no eyes at all. But nevertheless, they can guide themselves with great efficiency using only the reflections of their own self-produced vibrations from objects around them. If I put the obstacles in the tank, I hope we'll see that the fish will swim in and out of them just as well as if they had eyes. You see? The fish is avoiding the obstacles just as well as if it could see them. But the only information that it has about those obstacles is coming from these lateral line detectors, looking again at reflections of vibration. The next visitor, please, is a South African clawed toad, the Xenopus toad. And this is a particularly nice animal to demonstrate the lateral line because it's so easily visible on this animal. Well, I think I'll take him out. He's a lovely animal. He has very well-developed eyes, but he also has a lovely lateral line. If I hold him, if you'll let me hold him, just along the side of the body, you can see a pattern almost as if he's been sewn up along the edge of his body. Those are the lateral line structures. Well, he's quite happy like that. Here are the lateral line structures along the side of the body, appearing as little dimples. Okay, put him away before he hops off. Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you. Now, in the next slide, we can see the lateral line structure of the Xenopus toad. Here it is. Here are those stitches along the side of the body. They have little solid levers that stick up out of them, and underneath the levers are a set of these universal hair cells, again detecting vibration. The next piece of slide, which was made by Peter Görner in Germany, shows a Xenopus toad attracted to vibration of water. In this case, the Xenopus toad has had its eyes covered so it can't see. Nevertheless, when the water vibrates, the toad jumps towards the vibration, using only its lateral line to detect the presence of the vibration. Thank you. Well then, fish have sense organs that we really don't know about at all, that detect something different from any of ours, and they use them to communicate with each other and to guide themselves. Perhaps the most impressive use of the lateral line for social communication is amongst fishes that swim in schools or shoals. The next piece of film shows fish swimming together and showing the quite characteristic sudden changes of movement, coordinated movement, amongst thousands of fish, all at the same time, although they swim very, very closely. The way that they can communicate their movements to each other and guide each other is not through vision, but through detecting the movements of nearby fish through the lateral line. Well, we've seen then so far the way in which animals have been able to utilize our sorts of sensory cells to do things that we can't quite do. But let's go back to the original question. Could there really be sense organs that we couldn't have any understanding of at all, that we couldn't even have glimpsed through the narrow windows of function of our own sensory systems? Could there be sensory organs that are quite different from our light detecting, chemical detecting, temperature detecting, and mechanical detecting organs? Well, indeed there are. Animals have developed other sensory systems quite unlike anything that we have. First of all, many fish have the ability to detect electric fields. The best known examples of these are fish that produce electricity themselves and have electric receptors in their lateral line which can pick up the signals produced by the electric fields around them, the self-produced electric fields. They use them rather like a bat for guidance, for sonar, but using electric signals rather than sounds. Now, I'd like to demonstrate to you here an animal that uses electricity for a purpose other than just sonar. It uses it as a form of attack to stun other animals. This is an electric catfish, a South American electric catfish. And if I move him down to the other end of the tank near the camera, would you like to turn around? That's a good boy. Okay. Those clicks you can hear are very high voltage pulses being given off by him. I'm going to touch his body and see if there's a pulse. And another. And another. Those are shocks that are strong enough to hurt me if I put my hand into the water. And he would use them to stun animals, smaller fish, that he was going to eat. Thank you very much. Now, this is another form of electric fish. It's a gymnarchus. It uses electricity not to stun its prey, but to communicate and to guide itself. Can we listen to what it's doing? That isn't electronic noise. That's the noise of the fish. The fish is producing quite a high frequency, extremely regular series of pulses, which it's sending out into the water. Electric pulses, which it uses partly to tell other fish where it is, partly to study. Oh, there's the signal, much louder. Yes, we're closer to the tail. The signal comes from the specialized muscles in the tail. It's sending out a signal of very precise regularity. The variation is less than 1/100th of 1% in the signal frequency of this fish. And it uses it partly for guidance and partly for communication. Thank you, Tom. Many fish can detect electricity even though they don't produce it themselves. And perhaps the best known category of such fish are the sharks. I'd like to fill out this description of life in the water by telling you how a shark might go about attacking a fish. What sensory systems would it use? Well, first of all, sharks have extremely good senses of smell. They can smell blood in the water up to a distance of 1/2 kilometer or more. And the best of the sharks at doing this is the hammerhead shark, shown in the next piece of film. The hammerhead shark has its nostrils at the end of this strange hammer on its head. So it can tell the direction of smell by waggling its head from side to side. And that's what it does when it's hunting. It's telling the direction of smell. Sharks can also hear other fish in the water, especially if they're swimming in a strange way, if they're injured, up to a distance of 1 kilometer or more. This might then send the shark heading towards its quarry. As it gets closer, within a few meters, it will use its lateral line system to detect the vibration of the source. But finally, as it homes in on the target, as we can see in this next piece of film, finally what it uses to determine exactly where it bites is its electric sense. It picks up the tiny electrical fields created by the skin and the gills of the fish that it's attacking. All biological tissue has electrical fields associated with it, although they're very small. The shark has become very clever at detecting them to guide its final strike. Well, could there be any other senses that we couldn't have dreamt about? Well, there are. There are animals that can detect magnetism. The first animals that were thought possibly to be capable of detecting magnetism were pigeons. It was suggested long ago that pigeons might actually contain a compass. And we'll see tomorrow, or in the next lecture, that they do have a compass in their head which they use to guide them. But the first definitive description of magnetic sense in an animal came in a much humbler organism, a bacterium. Could I have the next piece of film, please? This is a bacterium that has inside it a string of beads. These beads are ferric oxide. They're magnetite. They're ferromagnetic. They move towards magnetic poles. And here in this picture, we can see the bacteria being dragged from one side to the other of a dish by an electromagnet whose polarity is being switched backwards and forwards. The bacteria are literally pulled by the magnetic attraction of the magnetite in their body. These bacteria live in ponds, and they probably use their magnetic sense, if you like to call it that, to move them downwards towards the bottom of the pond, to move them away from the surface. Well, over the last few years, it's been suggested, and more evidence has grown, that other animals might have magnetic sense. Calculation shows that we, or animals, would require only tiny, tiny amounts of magnetite in our bodies, connected to nerve fibers, presumably, to give us a magnetic sense that would tell us where we are. In the last few years, people have begun to discover little deposits of magnetite in the bodies of many, many animals. In fish, in turtles, in bees, in pigeons, and in human beings. Yes, it's possible that human beings do have some mysterious magnetic sense. There's no evidence for a nerve connection to the magnetite, but it is just possible that we, or some of us, are able to sense the direction of the magnetic field of the Earth. The next picture shows a piece of magnetite found in the neck muscles of a pigeon, between the muscle and the overlying tissue. It's possible that pigeons, homing pigeons, use this magnetite to give them some kind of internal magnetic compass, which tells them where they are in the world. Well, we've seen then in this lecture the way that other animals are able to explore beyond the range of sensitivity of our sorts of sense organs. But more than that, we've seen examples of animals that have senses that we couldn't even have dreamt about. It's not that we shouldn't be proud of our own sensory systems, because our sensory systems tell us what we need to know about the world. And with typical ingenuity, where we haven't got sense organs to know about things that we want to know, we make them for ourselves. We haven't got the ears of a bat, but we can make a bat detector. We can't generate ultrasound ourselves, but we can make an artificial bat. In fact, we can use X-rays. We can study gamma rays. We can use AC circuitry. We can use every form of energy around us, building, as it were, our own physical sense organs. We have extended our sensory world by utilizing physical instruments. I'd like to introduce my final guest in this lecture to illustrate one of the crowning achievements of the use of instrumentation to extend the senses. This is Mr. Brian Payne. Brian, I wonder if you'd just come forward. Brian, I should explain, is totally blind and has been from birth. Could you tell us, Brian, what you do?
Yes, I work in British Telecom as a technical officer for the handicapped in the data processing executive, and I'm the honorary founder chairman of a charity called Electronic Aids for the Blind.
And you're wearing an aid?
I'm wearing an aid called Sonic Guide.
Well, this, if you could just turn towards the audience, this pair of spectacles contains essentially a bat, a high-frequency ultrasound emitter and a detector, which then converts the sound into audible frequencies, which Brian can hear. Do you think you could show us how you can use the apparatus? Could you navigate, do you think, between a couple of poles?
Yes, I could do that, and then perhaps if there was a third one placed that I could locate,
yes.
And then I would just go out and put my nose on it.
You could get that precisely?
I think so.
Okay, well, let's put a couple of them out. Look, here are two poles.
We need two poles.
We're going to put two poles in front of you, about 3 feet apart.
Okay.
Could I ask you to come up, just to show that this isn't a trick? Could you just put this one anywhere in front along this line, anywhere you want to? Okay.
I'm just going to turn up the aid a little bit.
That's fine, yes, thank you.
Now I'm locating the two poles. There's one, and there's the second one. And I can now take my position, walk between the two, and I've now picked up the objective that I'm after, and provided it's not a diving moth, I should be all right.
That's extraordinary.